Before Joe DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer, he was given other names: the Cordova Cat Burglar, the original Night Stalker, and the East Area Rapist, just to name a few. Between 1973 and 1986, DeAngelo terrorized Californians, breaking into hundreds of homes across 11 counties. Entire neighborhoods were on high alert, and yet that didn't stop DeAngelo from sexually assaulting as many as 50 people and murdering 13. In her podcast, Man in the Window, journalist Paige St. explores how police failures and attitudes towards rape allowed DeAngelo to evade arrest for 4 long decades. And just a warning, this episode does detail sexual violence. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. Paige, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's start at Joe DeAngelo's first known victim. Who was she and what happened?
Well, the first known victim, according to police files, is a woman named Phyllis Zitka. And I have to add an asterisk here every time we talk about victim number one, because there's a firm belief, especially in the victim community, that there were prior victims.
Of course.
And it's pretty strong evidence that there had been prior rapes. But this was the one that the original detectives investigating the case, I think they got clued in around rape number 5 or 6, and then they started backtracking. And that brought them to Phyllis Zitka, who was the daughter of a former police officer who was in military security at the time. And that was kind of part of the pattern, it would turn out later, in terms of Joe DeAngelo's fascination and antagonism with anything related to law enforcement. But she was asleep in bed at home alone. Her dad was across the country, visiting other family. And suddenly she's woken and she thinks it must be a dream, because there's a man in front of her, no pants on, at the foot of her bed, telling her that he's going to rape her, telling her to comply. And she pulled the covers back over her head in disbelief. And then the assault, came forward. At this point, he binds her, he ransacks the house, he rummages through her drawers, etc. But he leaves after one assault. Later on, he will rape women again and again through the night.
How old was Phyllis?
Phyllis was in her young 20s. I am hazy on her age at the time. She was an outgoing woman until this night. This night changed her life. Not just the rape, but how she was treated by law enforcement, by the community, not family. Her father was very close to her and heartbroken that he had not been there to stop this and to help her. But after that, Phyllis became kind of retreated into herself, became fearful, and people kept telling her to get over it, to kind of ignore that anything had happened. I mean, after a few hours in the hospital, an offer by a nurse to have a contraceptive pill, a ride home by a police officer who kept asking her, is she sure she didn't know her attacker?
He kept looking in the rearview mirror. He goes, can you identify him? No, and he kept asking a lot of questions. Made me really, really uncomfortable. And I finally says, no. I says, I can't. I says, no. And he goes, are you really sure?
As though she's hiding something from police. Dropped off back at the house at the crime scene and left there alone.
Oh, God.
And so it was a horrific experience.
It's just so awful, yeah.
Yeah, that was rape in the 70s.
And her not knowing her attacker affected the way the police investigated the crime, correct?
Correct. They basically didn't investigate. I got access to the original police file for her and all of the other cases. And they looked on the property. They checked to look for any obvious signs of fingerprints. or footprints outside, found nothing to go on, and pretty much closed the case file. That was it.
And as you mentioned, we don't think this was his first crime. With the investigating that you did, where do you think it all started with him?
It started with him as a child. He was a bit of an odd child. He had roamed Rancho Cordova. This is a Air Force Base town. This is where Phyllis lived. As a kid himself, his dad was in the Air Force. His mom was often not at home. He was left at home alone to take care of his two younger siblings, and a lot of pressure. But he would start to roam, and he had a friend who would go with him, and they would begin breaking into homes, breaking into garages, stealing food, because that's what they were craving. These kids didn't have a lot, and Joe would bring home like a roast and feel like some sense of, being a provider, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But then a dog approached the kids, the boys, and D'Angelo threw a firecracker under the dog, killing it, to the horror of the other boy who was with him. But D'Angelo's swiftness and rapidity to just dispatch a barking dog rather than to run away was a very early sign. A family friend recalled a peeping Tom at her window. And now when I found her years later, she thinks it might have been Joe, but there's pretty strong belief that he had begun peering into windows. That was the MO, and that's hence the name of the series, Man in the Window, because always, all the way up to the very end, was still what people would see. They'd see a face in the window, because he scoped out the homes he would enter. He examined and studied the victims that he would attack. Police would find cigarettes under a tree by a window, at a property where he had later raped someone. So he was frequently there at the window in the backyard in the dark.
It's really, really scary. I mean, the peeping Tom was obviously getting towards that sort of, I don't even like to call it sexual, but the idea of terrorizing women. When did it move towards actually harming women?
Right. He then progressed from looking into windows to breaking into homes and became what they call a hot prowl burglar. He would enter homes first when people weren't there and go through the underwear drawers, lay underwear all about, a very obvious sexual nature to his prowling and burglaring. And he'd steal a few things, mementos, trophies, an insignia ring, a class ring, a wedding ring, items that had great significance to the person, but otherwise, in terms of value, of no great worth. He began doing this while he was a police officer in Visalia. That's where he earned the moniker, the Visalia ransacker. And he would hit like 12, 13 homes at a night, going through backyards and alleyways. And the first murder was an attempted abduction of a girl from her home in Visalia. The dad interrupted. He saw his daughter being dragged away. He leapt out at Joe and tried to stop him from taking his daughter. D'Angelo gave a swift kick to the girl and then turned and fired his gun on the dad and killed him, and then ran off. And so that is murder number one.
So when D'Angelo was starting out, he would attack women who were home alone, but that changed. He actually started involving their boyfriends and their husbands if they were home. Can you talk to me about that escalation?
This is when it becomes obvious that for D'Angelo, it's not about raping a woman. It's about power. And he ups the ante for himself as he becomes basically infamous. As there are reports on the local TV news and stories in the newspaper about a serial rapist in Rancho Cordova and the surrounding area, he begins widening the geography to becoming much more audacious and terrifying, as though he's feeding off of that fear. And so he began attacking women while they were at home with their husbands. And the couple would be in bed. He would then, subdue both people at the same time with a gun. Both victims blinded by his flashlight and a gun pointed on them. He'd force the woman to tie up her partner, and then he would take the woman into another room, but within earshot, and sexually assault her. And this attack would last hours and hours. He would roam the house. He'd pull food out of the refrigerator. He'd go back into the room and warn the man to not move. He began balancing cups and plates on the backs of the men, telling them that if he heard those fall, he would kill everybody in the house. Then there were couples that had children in the house at the same time, and they either slept through the attack or he would lock them in their bedrooms or a bathroom and blindfold the victims, leave them on the floor. The victim would think he had left, and the house would be quiet, and she'd begin to move, and he'd be there in her ear, I told you not to move. And he had this horrifying way of speaking, through clenched teeth, in that way that the women and their husbands who talk to me about these attacks, just a bolt of terror goes through them when they hear that sound or try to describe for me that sound.
Yeah. And these men experienced a different, terror as well. And probably in today's day and age, we'd say PTSD and all those things that come from these attacks. But because of the time that it was, these men had to sort of suffer in even more silence. Can we say that?
Absolutely. These men are victims too. And nobody, even today, few people recognize that they are victims of a violent crime. And only two spoke with me about that. And one finally began seeing a therapist, and another just still was railing against the local police department that D'Angelo had worked for. He had moved back closer to where these crimes were, to a little town right near where I live, Auburn. It was a police officer there, and this man, Victor, was convinced that the department should, bear some responsibility, that one of its officers is out there doing this, and likely doing it while on shift and using his police resources.
What did you discover about that whether he was able to, because he was a police officer, get away with it for so long or hide what he was doing?
Well, the detectives in the case tell me that because they never suspected, right? The last person that they thought that who would have been committing these crimes was another officer. But they told me first they felt that his pursuit of a police career was training in how to hold power over people. It gave him knowledge of what to do to avoid being detected. And he had access to personal confidential information. This was not an age of internet and stuff, right? But he could help scope out his victims, know the police resources in the area where they lived, had a police scanner. He could listen to officers who were trying to create traps looking for him and slip right through those. Mm-hmm. Passing himself off as an officer and stuff. So it did help him.
Were there any times where you think that maybe he was actually directly involved in something to do with his own case?
There came up a time later, some guy at a bar had made a comment that he knew who the East Area Rapist was. The officer who was asked to investigate that tip was Joe D'Angelo. And I have a copy of the brief report he filed that there was no grounding for that claim.
Interesting.
Of course there wasn't, because that was him.
Yeah.
But that was the only incident where I found that he was in some way asked to investigate himself.
The media in the 70s began referring to the crimes and to Joe as the East Area Rapist. How did the public respond to that?
The first reports that hit a newspaper telling people about these series of rapes terrified the community. There were meetings in school halls, in cafeterias. There was a mad rush to buy guns, to adopt dogs from the pound.
A few weeks ago in Sacramento, it was hard to find homes for the larger dogs like this one. But now suddenly, all that has changed.
And a lot of lectures on TV about the importance to lock your sliding glass door, your patio door.
Just lock your door. In most of those East Area rape cases, the rapist has simply strolled right into the victim's house through an unlocked door or window.
Didn't matter that none of that would have helped, because, and that's the thing, that law enforcement didn't tell people what to watch for. They kept it a secret that he had been prowling these neighborhoods and been seen repeatedly prior to the attacks. And that's the point at which he could have been, caught if people were aware of what to look for, but they weren't. During that time of the dawn of the women's rights movement, women began doing rape attack training, right?
Yeah.
Learning martial arts and how to protect yourself and how to shoot a gun and stuff like that. So it gripped Sacramento like a storm.
So I have to admit, I'm scared to death.
Because he moved down here Saturday.
Because he moved out here on the south side.
We weren't too, concerned when he was in the East Area, but since he's moving closer, and it seems like don't know where he's going to hit next.
And of course, that is when he escalated and began ramping up the fear of the attacks, feeding off of that frenzy. But it was the headline, the main story on the front page of the paper practically every day. And then usually something that the woman did wrong. She failed to lock her patio door, something like that. The truth was he had been breaking into these homes prior and unlocking doors and windows and staging the house for the attack.
It was so premeditated, his crimes.
Yeah. No, I'm just remembering the times that there were police in one community. Police were on the street looking for him. He had been seen in the neighborhood. They were going back and forth looking for him. He had stolen bicycles, which is one of his MOs of how to get around. And he was there in the neighborhood. And then as soon as they left, he raped a woman. He just stayed. He probably sat on a roof, waited for it to get quiet, and then popped down and continued his attack.
As he moved around from town to town, you mentioned that police politics impacted the investigation. Can you give me a little bit more information on how that worked?
Yes, the most striking one was very early when detectives realized that we had a serial rapist in the East Area of Sacramento. They were contacted by police officers from Visalia that had the Visalia ransacker, who thought there might be a connection. And the police chief in Sacramento went as far as holding a news conference saying that was preposterous. And there was no credibility to that. Different size shoes were his proof.
Jeez.
And this was so early, because then they could have looked at connections between Visalia and the East Area. The rapes began where Joe D'Angelo had raised as a boy. He had worked as a police officer in Visalia. There were, connections that could have started them on that path. In the end, I believe that there were rapes that were not reported because they were in the Oakland area and the Bay, and there was a multi-jurisdictional task force that had been created, and I think the police chiefs had decided that they had had enough of this and they didn't want any more of these unsolvable cases, so they stopped connecting and adding more rapes. There was another time then later when there were murders in South California, and an opportunity in a meeting to connect with the police chief in Sacramento about whether the East Area Rapist was now what was called the Night Stalker. He was the original Night Stalker. And there was a decision to not allow a joint investigation, to not turn over the Sacramento files. And again, that was a police chief who wanted to keep the image of safety during a difficult re-election campaign.
I mean, it's certainly not the first and last time we'll hear about those things, but it's just so frustrating when you can see in hindsight all the opportunities you had to stop something so bad from getting worse.
Right. Yeah, it is. And especially for the detectives who cared a lot about the case and constantly, were up against this kind of resistance.
Unfortunately, Joe DeAngelo isn't caught until 4 decades later. And he gets caught in the most modern of ways. Can you give us a recap of how police did catch him?
Absolutely. So there are 12 more murders that occur as he then goes further south, and his attacks become more and more violent, and people fight back, and then he begins killing them and bludgeoning them to death. Well, that leaves behind a lot of evidence. There is semen on bedspreads and other material and matter. At the time, nobody could do anything with that. The most they thought they could do was try to do his blood type. But then came along DNA. And that's when all of this madness stops. DeAngelo, the East Area Rapist, the Golden State Killer, whatever name you want to call him, disappears. The crimes completely stop. And decades pass. These become, dusty files, a matter of little interest except to a few crime writers. And then some investigators like Paul Holes begin returning to the evidence and looking to see if do we have a rape kit? Do we have any semen samples still that we can run the DNA on? Maybe we can find the guy. And there's a lot of political turf wars between police departments over sharing this, and testing what they have left destroys that. So there's also a wariness of being too reckless. But they run those DNA samples against everybody in the prison system. Nothing comes back. They're at another dead end until they realize that there are these family genealogy services that people are so fond of, and they have to find a way to crack into those databases. These are private records of people who are trying to do their own family research. As law enforcement officers, it's a bit maddening and somewhat controversial about what next happens, but that is where they find the clues to cousins. Not DeAngelo himself, but close enough that it begins to help them triangulate to who this man might be. And this was the first of those kinds of cases using family history DNA. And there have been many more since then.
It's fascinating, and it's even the controversy is interesting, because is it the ends that justify the means, or is it our right to protect our personal privacy?
Right.
Where's the right answer? And that's what's so interesting about some of these questions, right? Is there really isn't much of a right answer.
Yes. It is. And there are now new privacy rules, Ancestry and Family Tree, and these companies now have, more guarantees of privacy. And crime solving is great, but it has the potential in some countries. I had last time I reported on this, there were reports of political persecution in China using familial DNA. And I have found cases of mistaken identity and misarrest, including a man who had been arrested because of the crimes of a twin. But in this case, it is I think the only way that they found Joe DeAngelo.
What did you find out about who he was, and maybe a little bit as to sort of what was behind his crimes?
There's not much in the way of an explanation of what's behind these crimes, because his difficult childhood, very kind of cold, some allegedly somewhat abusive parents. That's not uncommon. Everybody who has that doesn't become a serial killer. So there's a lot more to Joe DeAngelo, and the question then becomes, why did nobody notice? What we had outwardly was a person nobody thought was normal. We had a man that children in the neighborhood were terrified of, as well as adults. He would be seen in his backyard pacing, muttering to himself. Same kind of behavior that happened in the living rooms and the homes and the kitchens of women while they were bound and gagged on the floor. That pacing, that ranting and raving, that talking to himself. He was fired as a police officer because he had been caught shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer, basically weapons that would be used in the attacks. What happened? He lost his job as a police officer. Was there any further investigation? No. And this is while there is the East Area Rapist at that point attacking and raping 40-some women. There were a few more rapes after that, but after he lost his job as a police officer, the rest of the murder spree kicked in. So what I found after he was arrested, though, was so much even more disturbing, because it became evident that his defense lawyers believed, and I was able to listen to interrogation tapes that the police department had made. But you could hear him taking on different voices as though he's talking to himself. The defense team realized they're dealing with someone who was extremely mentally ill. And DeAngelo, though, refused to allow them to mount a mental illness defense. In fact, he made no defense at all and rather quickly reached an agreement to plead guilty and confess to those crimes with which he was being charged. He never agreed to talk to law enforcement about why he did what he did or what other crimes he might have done, and if there are other victims. Never agreed to lead them to the trophies he would steal from people or, any of the physical evidence. In the very end, they had coincidental evidence and they had his DNA, and that's all he had. So if he had not pled guilty, they would have had difficulty tying him to all of the crimes to which he did admit. But to get back to your question, who is he? Very complicated person. He had some sexual drives that were very unusual. A young woman who was his fiancée for a brief period described the way he would, quote, make love would be to have intercourse with her repeatedly on the floor in the living room over hours and hours. Kind of the exact same behavior as that the rape victims experienced. And she just thought, well, that's men these days. That's the Playboy model of a super male.
Yeah.
And it's the 70s. It is a period of sexual tension, of sexual liberation, and sexual controversy, and everything very political, too. I mean, you had Phyllis Schlafly, you had the Equal Rights Amendment, you had women learning to speak out, you had a Take Back the Night movement, because streets did not have street lights, and 911 calls would often be placed on hold. And so women's safety was changing, and in part because of Joe DeAngelo, because of these rapes that were terrifying women in the community who were then asking for street lights and asking for 911 quick response and things like that, right? So in some way, the fear for him instigated changes that would go forward and help women.
Because he did plead guilty, there was no trial per se, but the victims were involved, and it was pretty emotional. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was amazing. So you have so many victims, and they all want to be present. And this was COVID. You could not put this in a courtroom. So after the victims were able to make their private statements on the stand about how this harmed, and that took days, and the children of victims and men and women told the judge about their feelings and what had happened to them, and could look at Joe DeAngelo and say this, right? He had to sit and listen to that.
I am the sister of Phyllis Henneman, who is known as rape victim number 1 also. I'm speaking her impact statement. On June 17th, 1976, I went to bed not knowing that in just a few hours, my life as I knew it would change.
But then for the actual sentencing and his admission of guilt, they went to a ballroom of a college in Sacramento, and the room was filled with people. The chairs were all spaced 4 feet apart or something like that because of COVID. And D'Angelo and the court, the judge, the prosecutors, and the defense team are up on the stage. And it was like watching theater.
Yeah.
And they would read each count with details. And he would say, I admit. By then, he's in a wheelchair. He's claiming he can't walk. The prosecutor is slipping us video of him in his jail cell bounding around cleaning it. But on stage, he's had the presentation of a frail, elderly man.
You talked to a lot of the women who were his victims. And, it's so many years later, and there's like a sort of false feeling at the beginning when you talk to them that they sound okay. But, you spend a bit more time after you go through the crimes. And all of them are not okay. But they all reacted sort of differently, right? And there was different things that lived in them during the years after.
Right. The women, as I began first convincing them to talk and to have their names be used, because remember the cone of silence? They are treated like they ought not to have their names known. They are treated as though they have something to hide or to be shameful of. And they were teenagers and young women at the time. Now they're in their 50s and their grandmothers, and they've never talked about it. And as they began to get my confidence, or I gained their confidence, I found that they were still who they were at the time inside. They were still a frightened teenager or whatever. And it was, though remarkable, in the next 2 years, talking about it allowed them to address it. And then they blossomed in each in their own way.
Oh, that's so interesting. You saw that change.
Yeah. I saw that. And that was one of the promises I made to them, because I don't do true crime. What this for me was an exploration of attitudes toward women in the 70s and rape victims. This is triggering because there are so many victims out there and so many who've never had a chance to speak. And toward the end of this, Chris Pedretti, I think she was victim. People knew each other by their number, like victims. I'm 7. That's how they'd introduce themselves when they started to meet each other. First, she started a Facebook group for other women who have never reported their rapes. It was a private group, and this is what became a safe place for people to talk and to begin to understand how to move forward long after the statute of limitations have expired, right? And that was the case here. D'Angelo is not convicted of any of these rapes. He confessed to them, but he was never charged. And then Chris began dealing with victim advocacy. And Phyllis, who became a very close friend of hers, died of cancer during this process. She was able to see D'Angelo sentenced and then died shortly after that. Chris started a program called Phyllis's Garden, and it goes into local police departments and changes the victim interviewing rooms, which were just a chair by a desk, right?
Like in public, where other police officers could hear.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So these are private, quiet rooms. She takes private donations because no police department has the money for an interior decorator. But they're beautiful places. And she gets the departments to agree they won't use it as break rooms. The only people who can have food in those rooms are victims. But it forces, not only is it a place that is so different than the one Phyllis Sitka and all these other women encountered when they were raped, it requires the law enforcement officers to have a change of mind about who they're interviewing. Right? It creates a humanizing shift.
When did those rooms get made?
This is a new thing. There's in the last year.
Isn't that unbelievable? It's a new thing.
Yes.
And it took a victim of rape to say these women need to have a good, quiet, comfortable space to share what must be one of the most traumatic experiences of their life.
Yes.
It's amazing. And so you say that you did this because you wanted to explore the cultural sort of response to rape in the 70s and 80s. But I mean, we're still dealing with that now.
Oh, we are. We still have untested rape kits. We still have a disbelief and mistrust of victims. There is still that surely you're making this up or you did something to make yourself vulnerable. There's a double-edged sword to the lessons that we give young men and women about protecting themselves as though they could stop it, right?
Yeah.
We create this false expectation.
You have a personal reason to have looked into this as well.
Yes, and it's not why I did not realize it at the time as I started, right? I'm gung-ho reporter, I'm jumping in. This began as a one-day turnaround little story of who is Joe DeAngelo, right? And thankfully, then 2 years later, I have an answer. But as I was doing this, I began to realize, hey, wait a minute. This is my family. My mother was raped when I was a young girl. Nobody talked about it. Nobody addressed her pain. She pressed charges. The man was acquitted. Other victims came forward. He was still acquitted. So she endured that whole system. And I remember the way even her parents treated her. And then the lessons she would give me about don't wear eyeshadow. You're just inviting attack.
So she bought into that too, yeah.
Well, yeah. And even though she was a fighter, right? Even though she's someone who,
of course, yeah,
who pressed charges, she still, in some way, felt that shame that had been pushed on her. As I said to my husband, this is not just my mother. This is everybody's mother's. This is who I'm doing this for. I became very aware of that then as this progressed. As I found how many other rapists there were at the time of the East Area Rapist, when DeAngelo is raping and traveling, through the entire North Sacramento to Bay Area, 50 victims. There were other pillowcase rapists, the woolly rapists, these serial rapists who were never caught.
What is Joe's fate then? Where is he now?
Well, the prosecution gave up the death penalty. That's what they wanted. But California has not executed anybody forever. So Joe DeAngelo got multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. So he is in prison until the day he dies.
And how are the victims today? It's been a while.
Yes. Well, Phyllis died. And that was so terribly sad because she's just an amazing woman and so strong and so funny. She would still crack jokes about her attack. That was how Phyllis dealt with things. Chris Pedretti, she's running this program, Phyllis's Garden, and putting so much effort and energy into changing the environment for victims. And some of the others go to CrimeCon conventions and stuff like that. And Paul Holes launched his entertainment career around this case. I think that's something he had always toyed with when he was on the law enforcement side. And then he got in front of the camera and he liked it a lot. And others have just gone on quietly. I heard from Victor not too long ago. He loves hunting and fishing. Those are his passions.
And how about you? How did reporting all of this? You said it was a one-day turnaround story that turned into a much longer project.
Yes. Well, I'm on to other projects. I've done other investigations.
Yeah.
This case did cause me to try to open up the files again for the man who raped my mother. I found out he's dead, that he had moved to a different state. I couldn't get the case file, the court documents. I've not been able to locate them. So she listened to me report this. She listened to the podcast. She didn't have anything that she wanted to say. So I think whatever she's feeling, because she's still alive, she lives with me now. She's 89. She's keeping it to herself. But she knows she can talk if she wants to.
Yeah. Well, Paige, thank you for this. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And I really did, even though it scared the life out of me, I enjoyed your podcast very much.
Well, thank you. It helps remind women and men that even if it's been 30, 40 years, they can still reach out. They can still address and seek some help, seek some understanding, and get some relief.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. We release a new episode every Monday, so please remember to follow the show in your podcast app. You can get our next episode a week early on CBC Podcasts' YouTube channel or by subscribing to CBC Podcasts' True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts. In addition to early access, subscribers to our True Crime channel also listen ad-free. Crime Story is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. Our producers are Nikki Manfredi and Mitchell Stewart. Sound design by Julian Uzielli and Mitchell Stewart. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Our video producer is Evan Agard, and our YouTube producer is John Lee. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director of CBC Podcasts.